So there's this organization. It's called the National Council of Churches. It's an organization that is really comprised of various denominations across our nation that are all focused on unity and trying to bring all of these different churches together. I know very little about the organization itself, and so this isn't necessarily an endorsement of that organization. I just heard a story about them that shaped the title of this series. So the headquarters for this organization is in New York. And it's said that the building, the headquarters, that building, it has an almost perfectly square architecture to it. And so people often refer to this building as the God Box. And when people would talk about maybe attending an event there or going to a worship gathering that was there, they would say that they're going to the God Box, or some would say, I'm going to church in a box, or I'm going to church in the box. And so the title of this sermon series is really kind of a play on that imagery of the building being this box. So much of Western Christianity has been confined to a box. And I mean that literally, right? So much of Western Christianity has been confined to a church building, so much so that when we think of church, we think of going to a building to have worship. Right? We think of church as being people who gather together in a building that's built specifically to seat hundreds of people so that we can go through some acts of worship and then say that we have done church. Western Christianity in many ways has become very building-centric. And coronavirus, if it's really done anything for the church, it's made that truth evident to so many of us. That so much of our view of church is building-centric, right? Because coronavirus, what it did was it essentially took away the box. And when coronavirus took away the box, when it took away our building, so many of us felt lost, and we asked, how can we do church, right? How can we recreate Sunday mornings? Everyone wants to know when we're going to reopen so that we can do church again. Some people are protesting because we haven't been able to do it sooner. We haven't been able to have our large worship corporate gatherings. I've heard some preachers talk about how this is a Daniel moment for so many of our churches in the nation, and that we need to stand up to the governing authorities to fight for our right to gather together in buildings so that we can be church. Even our own president, and this isn't a political statement, I'm not criticizing Trump in any way, but he's a public figure who made a statement that I think echoes what so many of us have thought and said ourselves. In talking about reopening churches, his statement was this: we need more prayer in our nation, not less. Again, the implication being that if we're not gathering together in our buildings, if we're not able to gather together and have these worship services, then apparently prayer is not taking place. I heard someone recently say that coronavirus has shown us our greatest idol, and that's our buildings. That COVID-19 has shown us what our idol is in Western Christianity, and it is our buildings. So, okay, don't get me wrong. I miss being together. I miss singing together. I miss the sounds of voices gathered around me. I miss your hugs, your handshakes. I miss breaking bread together. I miss being able to watch you fall asleep during my sermons. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong in having a church building, and I'm so looking forward to the opportunity for us to get back together. I'm so looking forward to the time when our building is kind of buzzing with excitement and busyness again. But a truth A truth that we need to remember is that the church does not need the box to be the church. You can still be church outside the box. We can still be church outside the box. So let's have a little discussion time right now. A few moments earlier, I said that I'd heard someone say that coronavirus, COVID-19, has shown us our idol, or one of our biggest idols, and that it is our buildings. So why don't we spend some time discussing maybe how does that sit with you? Do you agree with that, disagree with that? And if you agree with it, in what ways do you believe our building has become our idol? If you disagree with it, maybe why you disagree. I'm okay either way. But I just think it'd be a good discussion time. So spend some time discussing how does that make you feel to hear someone say that coronavirus has shown us one of our biggest idols, and it is our building. Spend some time talking about that, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I realize that if I'm going to be preaching about being the church outside the box, then I can't preach inside the box. I need to get outside the box. As far as we know, church buildings that were built specifically to house worshipers so that they could do worship together, as far as we know, they did not even exist until mid to late 3rd century. The very thing, think about that for a moment, the very thing that has become, for many, the very center of Christianity was something that was not even in existence for the first 3 centuries of the church's history. We know that they met in homes scattered throughout the communities, or some even shared spaces with the Jews in the area, and they would share those spaces together. Others would gather together out in open fields or by bodies of water so that they could perform baptisms and different things while they were worshiping. But we know that for like the first 3 centuries, there was no building built specifically for churches to worship in. They were scattered. And not only were they scattered all throughout the community doing things and not have a building, but they were also oftentimes being pursued or being persecuted. And so they were not able to actually to worship together in large groups out in the open in the public anyway, because that would have been dangerous for them. So they were dispersed. But it's in their dispersion, it's in their scattered nature that the church thrived. The church didn't just survive without church buildings, they actually thrived without church buildings. So in Acts 17 and verse 6, it's one of my favorite descriptions of the early church. The church was described as a group of people that were turning the world upside down. They were a group of people, a group of Jesus followers that were turning the world upside down. And I think that that's a powerful reminder to us of what the church really is, right? The question that has been on so many people's minds throughout this whole thing is, how can you be church when you can't go to church? But the truth that we need to be reminded of is a truth that many of us are taught when we were very little children, and that is this, that the church is the people, not the building. The church is a group of people that are following Jesus and turning the world upside down by the way they live their lives in their communities. So I love how Luke describes the church in Acts chapter 2. So we get Pentecost, we get the speaking in tongues, and everybody's hearing in their own languages. And at the end of Peter's sermon, they say, what do we need to do? They were convicted. He says, repent and be baptized. And we find out that about 3,000 were baptized that day. And Luke says that they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to prayers. Well, naturally, our minds go to a church service, right? And so is Luke describing a gathering of believers? Is Luke describing an actual church service? Well, we don't really know, but I do like what Luke continues to say about this group in Acts chapter 2. In Acts 2, starting in verse 43, It says awe came upon the believers awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. And so you do have an allusion there to how they are being together, but there's just as much here that's saying that they're doing this church stuff. They're being Jesus followers, scattered more than gathered, right? They're out there and they're sharing their food in each other's homes with glad and sincere hearts. They're distributing funds to people that are in need. They're gathering together their possessions and sharing those with others. Luke isn't just describing a group of people who are going to church, but rather Luke is describing a bunch of people who are being the church. They're living like Jesus in the world. They're serving others. They're sharing meals together, and they're praising God. What about Acts chapter 4? You get another description. In Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32, it says, "Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses, they sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as they had need." Here's another description, I believe, of a group of people that are not just going to church, but rather they are being the church. Yes, they are a gathered people. They found time to gather together. The church, I believe, should gather together. But I believe that the witness of Scripture reveals a truth. And that truth is this, that the church does its best work, or I should say the church does some of its best work in the world, not when they are going to church, but when they are being the church. Listen, church, sometimes the church scattered is more powerful than the church gathered. I want you to think about that for a moment. Sometimes the church scattered is more powerful than the church gathered. And if the church truly is simply a group of people who turn the world upside down because they follow a man named Jesus, then it would make sense that they would actually do their best work scattered as opposed to gathered. So, let's spend a little bit of time talking about this, that the church does some of its best work when it is scattered rather than when it is gathered in its box, in its building. So let's talk about in what ways can the scattered church be more powerful than the gathered church. Spend a little time talking about that and we'll come back. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we turn the world upside down by being a church scattered rather than a church gathered? Well, I like what Michael Frost says in a book that he wrote not too long ago. The book's called Surprise the World. And he says in this book, the way that we do this is that we need to be living more questionable lives. Yes, you heard that correctly. He said that what the church needs to be doing is they need to be living more questionable lives. So what in the world does he mean by living more questionable lives? Well, let's look at Colossians chapter 4. Colossians 4 verses 2 through 6 says, "Devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray for us as well, that God will open to us a door for the word, that we may declare the mystery of Christ for which I am in prison, so that I may reveal it as clearly as I should." And listen to this, church. "Conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone." Did you catch it? Did you catch what Paul said? Paul says that we are to devote ourselves to prayer, and then he says that we are to act wisely toward outsiders, making the most of our opportunities. And then he says this, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone. Well, why would we need to answer everyone? Well, because we're living questionable lives. Because we're living lives that provoke questions from those who may not be familiar with Jesus or the gospel, and they want to know more about this life that we live. Because the way that we conduct ourselves and the way that we speak around them makes them want to know why we do and why we say what we're doing. In other words, we're living questionable lives. Now notice, Paul doesn't say that it's because we're morally better than all of them, right? We don't have some moral high ground. No, he says it has to do with the way that we bless others through our speech, that we speak with grace, that our speech is seasoned with salt. And he says, let your speech always be gracious. And then people are going to ask questions. And you need to be ready to answer those questions. Peter will basically say the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 3, where he says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. So in Michael Frost's book, Surprise the World, he says this. He says, the believer's function then was to pray like crazy and to conduct themselves in word and deed in such a way as to provoke unbelievers to question their beliefs and enter into an evangelistic dialogue. In other words, we are called to live questionable lives. We're called to be intriguing, right? Maybe even a little bit surprising, so that people, when they are around us, will want to know more about our faith and our love and our hope. And a sobering thought that I've really had to wrestle with since I've been dealing with this sermon series and kind of letting it roll around in my head, a sobering thought that I've had to wrestle with is this. We're doing it all wrong if no one ever asks us about our lives. We're doing it all wrong if no one ever asks us about our faith and our hope and our love. If our lives look pretty much like every other life all around us, if our lives look like every other law-abiding, respectable citizen, then what's so intriguing about that? What's so questionable about that? What's there even to ask? So, there's another cool passage that I think fits into this, and it comes from Titus, which is a book that doesn't get a whole lot of attention. And in this particular book in Titus, Paul is going to talk about how different people in the world should live, and he talks about young women and older women, and he talks about young men and older men. And then he addresses servants, or some translations even say slaves. Now, personally, I wish Paul would have just started some kind of abolition movement and just revolted against the whole system of slavery, but he didn't do that. And an ugly truth that we have to live with in Scripture is that during Paul's day, it very much was a slave or servant culture. And so Paul, at times, addresses slaves. He addresses servants. But what he says here in Titus to slaves or servants, what he says to them, I think is so applicable to all of us, to everyone, no matter what your lot in life is. I think what he has to say here to these servants in his letter to Titus is so applicable. And so he says this. He says, tell slaves to submit to their own masters and please them in everything they do. They shouldn't talk back or steal. Instead, they should show that they are completely reliable in everything so that they might make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive in every way. Did you hear that last part? So that they might make the teaching about God attractive in every way. I like the old King James Version. Its translation of this, it says, so that in everything they may adorn the doctrine of God. So when you're adorning something, what are you doing to it? Well, good old Webster tells us that to adorn something is to enhance the appearance of. It's to brighten something up or to make something more beautiful. It is to decorate it. And Paul says that our jobs is to decorate the gospel. That our jobs is to make the gospel attractive to others. He's saying, do all that we can do to make the gospel of Jesus attractive. That we should do all that we can with the way that we live our lives, with the way that we carry ourselves, with the way that we speak to others in our lives. That we should do all of that in such a way that it enhances the beauty of the gospel. That we should do that in such a way that people, because they see the way we conduct ourselves and because of the way that we speak to others, that they will actually be attracted to the gospel because of that. That the way we treat people will actually make the gospel look good to them. And here's the thing. I really believe that the church does that best when it is scattered, not when it is gathered. Our best opportunities to make the gospel attractive is not when we're gathered together in our box, but when we are outside the box, scattered in our communities, living out the gospel, speaking to people with grace, treating people with respect, serving our enemies, praying and blessing everyone we come across. Our best opportunities to make the gospel attractive is when we are scattered, not when we are gathered, right? When you figure out how to bless people in your neighborhood who live directly to your right or to your left or across the street from you, or as you're walking your neighborhoods, everyone you come across, you figure out how you're going to bless those people. Or when you go to work, if you're able to go back to work now in your offices, the way you treat people, the way you talk to them, it makes it attractive. When you go back to school in the fall, we do all that we can whenever we call customer service because we're really upset about something that we bought. The way we treat that person on customer service on the phone makes the gospel attractive. When we go to a restaurant and we bring and the server brings out the wrong food, or we have to wait a long time, how we act in that moment, how we treat that server in the moment. We have an opportunity there to make the gospel of Jesus attractive. We have an opportunity to adorn the gospel. And again, our best opportunities to do that are when the church is scattered, not when the church is gathered. So another discussion time, our last discussion time. What does it mean to you to adorn the gospel or to make the gospel attractive in every way? When you hear that, what are some things that you think about immediately? Spend some time talking about that. Okay, so I've shared this story before. It's one of my favorite stories from a Jim McGuigan book. Some of you know who Jim McGuigan is. He tells the story of a young priest who was sitting next to a soldier that was dying in the middle of the street. And the young priest comes up and he says, "Can I help you?" And the young soldier's kind of hard-nosed and cold. He's not really a church person. And so when he sees this priest, he's already on guard. And the priest kind of snaps at him and he says, "Well, I'm cold. You don't happen to have a blanket, do you?" And so the priest, in his silence, he takes off his overcoat and he lays it over this dying soldier. And the soldier just glares at him for a few moments. And then kind of with an angry sneer, he says, "My neck hurts. You don't happen to have a pillow on you, do you?" And so the young priest, he takes off another layer of clothing and he balls it up and he lifts the soldier's head up and he lays it under there and gets it just perfect so that it's comfortable for him. So now there's a lot of silence and glaring from the soldier, and the young priest is just sitting there next to him. And finally the priest says, "You don't happen to have a cigarette, do you?" To which the young priest finds a cigarette. He sticks it in his mouth, the mouth of the dying soldier. He lights it. The dying soldier lies there for a few moments, and he looks over at the priest and he says, "Mister, if you've got anything in that book that makes you act this way, would you read it to me? Would you read it to me?" You see, when the church is scattered, we find ways to bless all the people that we come across in our community, right? When the church is scattered, we live questionable lives. We speak in such a way that makes people want to know why we speak that way. We treat people with respect. We serve others. We bless them. And it makes people want to ask questions of us. And we prepare ourselves to answer those questions, right? We conduct ourselves in such a way that it makes the gospel attractive. We speak and we treat others in such a way that it actually adorns the gospel. So, church, what do you do when you can't go to church? Paul would say, be the church. You can't go to church. Be the church. You do what was always envisioned of the church from the very beginning. You be the church. You turn the world upside down with your questionable but attractive lives. And that is church outside the box.